Hi everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Tina, and I am the Capability Building Coordinator for Connecting Up and TechSoup New Zealand. I'd like to welcome you all to the webinar Shoestring Innovation, How to Think Like a Designer and Move from Ideas to Action on a Budget, which will be presented by Dylan Martyn from Wire8. We'll start with a bit of housekeeping. All lines are muted, so if you have any questions during the session, please type it in the questions box on your webinar panel. Dylan will answer them all at the end of the webinar. Please note that your comments and questions will not appear to the entire group. If you have any technical issues, please also type it in the questions box, and I'll try my best to help you out with any issues that you may experience. Please note that if you are on a Wi-Fi connection and have multiple programs open, this can sometimes affect the quality of the audio and video of the webinar. If possible, please close all other programs to help you have the best experience possible today. Before we start, I'd also like to remind you that this webinar is being recorded, and a link to the recording will be sent to you all within a week after the webinar ends, so you'll be able to access it at any given time. So that's all from me for now. I'll pass it over to Dylan to start the webinar.
Thank you very much, Tina, and good morning, everyone, or good afternoon for everybody joining us in New Zealand. My name's Dylan Martyn, and I'm excited to bring you this webinar, which I've called Shoestring Innovation, How to Think Like a Designer and Move from Ideas to Action, ... on a budget. First of all, before we get into it, I'd like to thank Connecting Up for providing their incredible platform that gives me the opportunity to share my experiences and my thoughts with you today. I had a lot of fun pulling this presentation together, and I even learned a few new things myself, so I really hope you enjoy it. Also, full disclosure, I'm actually just recovering from a case of the midwinter flu at the moment. I'm going to try and mute myself if I need to cough or take a drink, but just to apologize for that in advance. So let's get started. What if we could all dream about cows and save the world? There are many major discoveries that have happened throughout the course of human history where the discoverer was actually unconscious or asleep. Einstein was one of the most famous who came up with the theory of special relativity apparently while dreaming about cows. Go figure. Now, Einstein was a brilliant man, no doubt, but I believe that buried deep within all of us is a highly creative mind that's just one daydream or a brisk walk away from that next brilliant idea. And I've found that it's surprisingly simple habits, reminders, and processes that can unlock this in all of us. Hello. Greetings to everybody again in Australia and in New Zealand. It's great to have you join me today. My goal for today's webinar is to demystify the creative process and to share ideas for driving innovation and social impact. And what I'm really hoping that you'll take away from this webinar today is 5 common traits that highly creative organizations all exhibit in the path to innovation. Some really simple and effective tools to get you started on that journey. And some of my own ideas that I wanted to share with you all for applying that to challenges in the not-for-profit sector. When I started university, I wanted to work for just 3 companies: Apple, Dyson, or Sony. You could say that I had pretty high ambitions. And while my original fascination, I was studying industrial design at the time, by the way, was with their innovative products, my obsession grew into my postgraduate years into more of a curiosity. What was it about these organizations and many others around the world that made them so special? What made them consistently stand out and see the unmet needs that everybody else seemed to miss? After graduating in 2006 from Otago University in New Zealand, I got my first job as a design strategist for a consultancy called DEGW. Now, this was a very unique organization and I loved my time there. We mixed science and architecture to help create office environments that tangibly improved communication, productivity, employee engagement, and yes, of course, innovation and creativity. Some of the images that you'll see here are examples of the outcomes from a few of my most favorite projects. Also, I think it's interesting that just in the last few years, we've seen the importance of creativity as well as complex problem solving and critical thinking move into the top 3 traits in the World Economic Forum's Future Jobs report. Now, why is this shift happening? Well, the shift, I think, is not only coming from advances in technology like artificial intelligence, which is already beginning to disrupt the way we work. It's also being driven from the fact that, in simplistic terms, as the global population grows, the problems that we have to solve become more and more complex. The world is awash with data. And to solve these problems requires new ways of addressing these challenges. And for the past decade, I've been fortunate enough to travel and work on projects all across Asia in many different cultures and sectors, from a call center in Bangalore to an investment bank in Tokyo, a university in Hong Kong, a Crown Research Institute in New Zealand, a government department in Melbourne, a co-working space in Adelaide, the list goes on. Now, why am I showing you all of these logos, 99% of which are for-profit organizations? Well, while it's true that I've spent the majority of my career so far working with for-profit companies, these organizations are filled with people who are also trying to innovate, just for different reasons. And what I've learned from these organizations is what makes creativity thrive or suffocate inside an organization. And I feel that these lessons are transferable to the not-for-profit sector in many ways. And while I enjoyed the travel and the complexities of solving cross-cultural challenges inside these huge corporate ecosystems, I didn't ever think that something was missing. I was having a great time. And then in 2016, something happened. I had an opportunity to run a co-design workshop with the Asylum Seeker Resource Centre here in Melbourne, an opportunity that actually came to us through Telstra, who was working with a client of the firm I was at the time. We were invited in to run a half-day workshop aimed at building a stronger cross-cultural community within their membership, who was getting close to 3,000 to 3,500 constituents at the time. We were fortunate to have the opportunity to work together with 50 asylum seekers on this challenge. And for me, to see people whose lives had literally been turned completely upside down from so many cultures, all diving in with their ideas, regardless of their beliefs, their abilities, or their professional qualifications, was an incredibly humbling and a joyful experience. And it was this experience that helped to reassert one of my strongest beliefs that I want to share with you now. Creativity is a gift that every human possesses. When it's awakened and harnessed, it can bring communities together to solve complex problems and imagine new futures. And so through my experiences with the ASRC, with the Red Cross, the Royal Children's Hospital here in Melbourne, to name just a few, I moved on from my regular corporate salary and I decided to pursue a new mission. And that is to help organizations and communities have a greater social impact through building their creative confidence and to inspire individuals to lead with creativity. And I truly believe that with practice, this can be achieved by anyone by applying a surprisingly simple creative process. And I'm going to talk to you about that now. So what I want to share with you today are 5 core things that I believe you can start inside your organization, within your project team, or just as an individual to jumpstart your creative brain. And you can use these 5 things to produce consistently breakthrough solutions to your organization's biggest problems. As I go through these 5 principles, I'm going to share with you examples along the way that I hope will spark ideas for how you might be able to employ these 5 principles quickly, cheaply, but with maximum impact and scalability. And lastly, with each of these 5, I'm going to share some tools that I use when on projects, which I think can be replicated easily and implemented by anyone. So here we go. Number 1, creative organizations, they get inspired through empathy. Now, many quote unquote designers will tell you, if you want to know what your user needs, you need to talk to them. Seems kind of obvious. You need to see how they act, what they do, where they go. And for the most part, this is true, but real empathy is doing all of these things and then going one step further. It's about putting yourself in the shoes of the customer or constituent so that you can feel and think as they do. As the saying goes, if research doesn't make you feel like a different person, you're doing it wrong. Now, the other great thing about building empathy is that it can also serve a dual purpose. It can be used to gather deep qualitative understanding of a context, a challenge, or a user need. But it can also be adapted to create experiences and raise awareness for those key stakeholders you seek to connect to a cause or vision. I've got a couple of examples here of tools that are often used to build empathy within creative organizations. The first one we call empathic immersion. Now, this is where you can simulate the circumstances of your user excuse me, and live out that experience. One example that's recently been in the press is the Vinnie's CEO sleep out, where top executives are placed in the experience of sleeping rough for a night so that they gather empathy and can empathize with those people that are homeless to create more awareness. Shadowing or ethnographic observations is where we go out and we observe our users in their own world. We share in their experiences and we see things that are often hard to put into words. Journey mapping. Now, a lot of you might have heard this terminology before. It's becoming quite popular. This technique involves mapping out the experiences of what your constituents do, see, think, and feel, but we do it over time, over a continuum, a day in the life, if you will. Now, this helps shift an organization's lens towards letting constituents' experiences drive decision-making rather than internal processes. Photo diaries. This is a fun one. This is one that I do with a lot of organizations I work with, where we identify a small group of participants and we ask them to take a series of images of key things to create a kind of collage of life experience, which includes things, objects, people, and places that they most value. And a lot of this information that comes back is incredibly rich and has some fantastic narratives attached to it. What does this look like in practice? Well, I have one example here of building empathy to inform design and innovation. For me, it was the 6 weeks that I got to spend shadowing clinical staff from across 76 medical departments as part of the design development for the new Royal Children's Hospital in Melbourne. Now, although some of the things that I saw were truly heart-wrenching, After seeing these things, not only through staff, but also parents and children's eyes, it helped me to understand not only the functional needs for the new hospital, but their experience at an emotional level. I could see what they were going through, and it made me a better designer as a result. Number 2, creative organizations reframe problems and they encourage divergent thinking. I've found that when a new problem is identified by a creative organization, their structure is flexible enough to allow multidisciplinary teams to form easily. And when these project teams form, their first task is not to start solutioning. Excuse me. It's to set a course, a vision that will inspire novel ideas and encourage people to take risks as they work towards new solutions. When a problem is reframed, it can motivate people to look outside existing paradigms, existing beliefs or perceptions, to go broad. Consider other disciplines or sectors for inspiration and learning. An example I can share with you here, in a workshop recently, I was running recently, that focused on improving the public transport experience in Melbourne. Now, for those of you that take public transport every day, sometimes it's an experience that we like to repress, or we like to stick our heads in our phones and not talk to anybody. It can be quite a challenging thing to think about improving. Now, instead of starting with an obvious question like, how can we better design train stations, which often yields only ideas that are built off existing solutions, they're very narrow, I asked the group to start with the question, how might we design a public transport experience that commuters actually look forward to? Can you imagine that? This really challenged the group to move from just making things a little bit better to shooting for delight. In the end, the best ideas actually came from us sharing our most memorable holiday experiences and hotel experiences and trying to imagine those experiences being recreated in a train station, all off just a slight reframing of the problem. I have a second example here, also from a recent project. And this is also about bringing a new perspective to a problem that can open your mind to new solutions. I was working on a team. We're designing a corporate headquarters for a fairly bland insurance company. This image is not actually from their space. I'm kind of exaggerating it to make a point here. And I'm not going to name the client. This insurance company wanted to explore ways to make their environment inspiring. They wanted it to be interesting. They wanted it to be dramatic. But at the same time, they wanted it to be flexible. And of course, they wanted it to be cost effective. So we thought about these criteria for a while and how we might stretch their thinking. So what did we do? Of course, we wheeled in a theatrical set designer to participate in some of the workshops. They were there to provide some left field design ideas, and they really did that. This was actually perfect as set designers work with the same criteria and constraints in their projects. They often have a very low budget. The solutions they create are highly modular and flexible, but they're always looking to make the biggest impact to their audience at the lowest cost. Needless to say, our theatrical set designer and his larger-than-life personality was an absolute hit, not just from an inspirational point of view, but also from a functional and an operational point of view. Number 3, creative organizations, they shelve constraints and they generate lots of ideas. Now, there are probably a lot of people on this webinar right now who've been to a quote unquote an ideation or a brainstorming session, right? And this always seems like a lot of fun. We use a lot of post-its, it's high energy and it feels productive, right? This is an image of a workshop that I ran recently at a co-working space here in Melbourne. But what's actually happening here? And does it actually help us to be more creative and come up with better quality ideas? Now, here I like to quote Linus Pauling, who's a scientist and a 2-time Nobel Prize winner, underlined scientist, who put it, To have a good idea, you must first have lots of ideas. And in actual fact, research has shown that teams who come up with more than 5 ideas to solve a particular problem are 50% more likely for that idea to reach a launch stage than those who come up with less than 3. And what we're doing here when we ideate is to push past the logical, the obvious, the incremental innovations that our brains have already been conditioned to produce. It's like a knee-jerk reaction. We find the quickest solution to the problem so we can move on to the next one. But if we delve further into our limbic system of our brains, the more we can stretch our thinking to find new relationships, new variants, new extremes. I have a couple of quick guidelines if you're thinking about running an ideation session in your organizations. First one, resist the urge to defer judgment. We all like to, my phrase is black hat an idea if it seems too crazy or unrealistic. But we need to let those ideas come out. It aids the flow of conversation. We have to get ridiculous. Sometimes it's the craziest ideas that spur thought in other people that leads us to the best solution. We also go for quantity, as I mentioned before, moving past those incremental logical ideas to stretch our thinking. And we build on the ideas of others. Now, funnily enough, brainstorming is commonly misunderstood in organizations where the best results, and again, research is there to back this up, best results of brainstorming is where you take the collective ideas of the group and you build off that, rather than having 10 people coming up with ideas all sitting in a room, but they're really just inside their own heads. Lastly is to be visual. Now, even if you're somebody like me that can only draw stick figures, it's always 100 times better to try and draw something to communicate your idea rather than just words on a page. There are also many techniques that you can use to have a successful ideation session if you're running low on ideas. And here's just a couple. I call this one to the left. If you're ideating in a group, you try and allow 30 seconds for each individual to develop one idea, and then everyone passes that idea to the left, and you use your neighbor's idea to spark your next, and so on. I also sometimes call this the brain blender, as you're mixing people's thoughts and building off each other. It's really fun. Secondly, extremes. Now, this is where you take the challenges that you're facing or your question, and you think of how they might be solved in the most extreme circumstances. One really cool example I have here was a hospital emergency department team were looking for ways to improve their response time in treating patients. What they ended up doing when they stretched their thinking was to actually recruit a Formula One pit crew to share their secrets to speed, efficiency, and safety management. The next one here is called a mashup. Sorry, just a technical difficulty here. 1 second. Okay, a mashup, as I was saying. Recently, we were brainstorming solutions to create a commuter experience. Actually, this was similar to the example I shared before about the train station. The idea here was to bring in experiences from service industries, whether it's hospitality or hotels, that we could incorporate into that experience. So looking at parallel industries and how those experiences could be mixed to come up with new ideas. This last one here is a personal favorite of mine. I call it the worst idea. Try asking your team to come up with 10 of the worst ideas they can think of to solve your problem. Now, the effect this has is it takes pressure off people. They relax and they have fun thinking of weird and wacky solutions, and they have a laugh. Now, however, often when you reflect back on these worst ideas, there can actually be an element of something that leads to something great. And again, it's your limbic brain being engaged and connecting, even when you might not be fully aware. I facilitated an ideation workshop with a group called the Change Management Institute of Victoria recently. Their membership consists mostly of internal HR representatives from a variety of large corporate organisations. Their goal was to identify ways in which they could build, in their words, a more magnetic community of CMI members. And it got to the point where they decided to ideate on extremes of change. This is a space they work in. They wanted to look at other contexts. One of the ideas they came up with by asking that question was to think about climate change and how it relates back to organisational change. And the idea they've actually decided to implement is to invite, funnily enough, a meteorologist to their next event to talk about the relationship between change in nature and change in organisations, which I think is a fantastic idea. And they wouldn't have come to that if they hadn't asked that question in the beginning to stretch their thinking. Excuse me. Number 4, creative organisations, they prototype early, but with a rough edge. Now, when I was in high school, I had the most fantastic physics teacher. Unfortunately, his name was Mr. Fawcett. And despite having this surname, he was actually the coolest teacher in school. We loved his class for 2 simple reasons. He let us make stuff and he let us break stuff. One semester in particular, he set us an assignment where we got to build kites. We started off sketching, then we built crude models that we would throw around the classroom, then to full-scale paper, and then finally to fabric with wood frames. Each team must have gone through dozens of ideas, dozens of designs, and literally hundreds of pretty spectacular crashes out on the playing fields. But of course, Mr. Fawcett knew exactly what he was doing. In every crash, there was a lesson. There was an improvement. There was the next innovation. Now, I've seen creative organizations act in a very similar fashion. Here is a series of prototypes for one of Dyson's earliest vacuum cleaners. Apologies for the resolution. Creative organizations get tangible with a solution as early on in a process as they can. They take incremental risks on the way to the best solution, and they learn as they go. Also, what's important here, the leader, or at least the person holding the project purse strings, which is Mr. Fawcett in my physics class example, they both set the clear expectation that failure is part of the learning process and the journey to the best outcome, and they build in resources, which is time, people, and money, to allow this to happen. They actually encourage it. And again, earlier is better to reduce the risk of larger costs and larger mistakes later on, as Dyson proves with their 5,127 prototypes of their vacuum cleaner. It's also really easy to prototype services through things like role-playing or storyboarding to demonstrate solutions that are intangible. And these are just 2 common methods, but there are many more. In fact, there is some role-playing in the example that I have to share with you now. Here is an example from a design firm called Tilt. They're based in London, amazing bunch of guys, super creative, and I've partnered with them on several projects. They always blow me away with their ideas. They were designing an ambulatory care centre in London, and they were experiencing, I'll call it, tension between the clinical staff and the engineers and the design team. So one evening, Tilt took over a car park in the basement, which is what this image is, of their existing building, and they built a 1-to-1 scale model of a treatment room. And what you're seeing in this image is Tilt inviting the clinicians to step into the space. They gave them a roll of duct tape and scissors and asked them to literally redesign any elements as they saw fit. Now, this was great for the engineers to see because the clinicians prioritized the quality of patient care and experience over the most efficient way to lay cables and pipes. Now, the result might have been more complicated to construct, might have been more difficult to service, but it ensured a human-centric perspective. And all of this whole experiment, this whole prototype happened in about 2 hours. It happened in a basement, and it cost Tilt about a dozen cardboard boxes, a bit of plywood, and a few rolls of duct tape. Very, very low cost innovation if I ever saw it. Number 5, creative organizations test in the real world. Now, number 5 is obviously closely connected to prototyping, but I believe it needs its own point. Even organizations who do prototype, and they might try lots of iterations, they still fail to test their solutions in the real world. This is very risky. I've even seen organizations make the excuse, we don't want to test with our customers because if it fails, what will they think of our brand? Well, I think there's a solution here. If you communicate clearly that you're testing and just looking for feedback, the users often welcome the opportunity to not only give feedback, but to actually contribute to improving the solution. And as with the overall theme of today, this can be done at a relatively small scale. And if you're only creating rudimentary prototypes, it's also very cost effective. Now, the image that's on the screen right now, this particular example I wasn't directly involved in. However, when I discovered it, I thought it was such a perfect example, I couldn't not share it. The empowerment plan in Detroit created a prototype of a jacket for the homeless. By asking homeless people for feedback on their prototypes, the organization improved the initial product by transforming the jacket into a convertible sleeping bag. Now, the company eventually evolved to give homeless individuals what they really needed, jobs, by hiring them to make the jackets. And this was something that only came to them by engaging with the homeless population in Detroit and getting their feedback. They actually learned more about their constituents. This only happened because the organization's process repeatedly demanded them to ask for feedback, which resulted in design changes that improved their product. Subsequently, their connection to an understanding of the homeless population in Detroit. Excuse me. So, there you have it. 5 things that creative organizations do to innovate. Now, as some of you may have realized, these 5 things actually form a process, which has a name. It is commonly called design thinking. Now, this process originated from a design consultancy called IDEO around 2001, who actually figured out a way to codify the traditional design process and apply it to problems in business, strategy, and now social impact. Now, when I came upon this process, it was quite transformative for me because it just confirmed and codified what I've been seeing inside these large organizations for the last decade. And it's only been in the last few years that social sector organizations have begun to apply this model to unlock creative potential and drive innovation for greater social impact. And for me, this is where it gets really exciting. If we could just imagine the possibilities, if we could all bring these 5 traits into not-for-profit organizations today, if you're not already, to explore, to experience, to experiment our way to better ideas and better solutions. To be clear, I'm not talking about simply going out and buying this capability or hiring a creative agency, which is why I put the on a budget wording into the title of this webinar. No, I'm talking about building a culture where every one of your employees thinks, acts, and works their way through problems in the same way as leading creative organizations like Apple, like Sony, and like Dyson. So what I'd like to do in this next section is to share what I think are 5 broad challenges faced by the NFP sector, which I think are consistent across New Zealand and Australia. And I want to talk to some examples of how I've seen design thinking applied to address these challenges. Firstly, the challenge of clarifying your mission and your purpose, aka cutting through the noise. With increasing competition from other charities, more competition from for-profits and other types of quote-unquote hybrid organizations, the challenge to be heard and to maintain a loyal following is great. Building empathy and using techniques that are common in design thinking enables us to uncover unmet and unarticulated needs, particularly in complex socio-cultural ecosystems, to deliver more impactful services and support those in need. It's also an incredibly powerful tool to connect at an empathic level with key stakeholders. I have an example to share on this in just a moment. It's also a really simple and cost-effective but impactful way to build empathy. A small example here might be to train and deploy your staff on shadowing missions and to be able to record observations about the hurdles that they see your constituents face. A quick example here is with Save the Children, where they observed mothers preparing meals for their families to find out why some children were well nourished while others were not. What they discovered, the insights they were able to spread from their observations throughout local communities to improve overall health and then also to improve their own services. A second example here, which I want to go into a bit more detail on, is the UN VR, or United Nations Virtual Reality. This project utilized what we call immersive storytelling to inspire greater empathy and understanding around today's major humanitarian challenges. Now, this initiative produced 10 VR short movies, which each tell the story of war victims or refugees. One of those films in particular, which I've seen, it's just 8 minutes long, is about 12-year-old Sidra, who's one of the many children living in the Zaatari refugee camp in Jordan. Sidra takes the viewer, or you, around the camp. She shows you her home, she shows you her school. And when Clouds Over Sidra was released in January 2015 at the Davos World Economic Forum, the emotional impact of the movie on high-level participants was palpable, to say the least. I have a slightly long quote here from the UN Secretary General, and the image here is of him and the executive director from the World Health Organization watching that film. I could draw your attention to the last paragraph there in this slide, where the quote, "I have only shame and deep anger and frustration at the international community's impotence to stop the war." And focusing in on those words, shame, deep anger, and frustration. It's these kind of emotive reactions that using these kind of empathic immersion tools can elicit an emotive response, which not only creates a deeper understanding of the issues, but it also spurs people to action. The other thought I had when I first watched this was that if this made so much impact in 2015, imagine what the technology is capable of now. And okay, full honesty, this one is not as low budget as some of the things I've been talking about today, but I'm willing to bet that it's a lot cheaper now than when this was first made. But you can bet in this case that the impact was well worth the investment. And speaking of fast-changing technologies, this actually brings me to my next challenge. The challenge of embracing fast-changing technologies. Often when we consider what new technologies are good for or how they can fit into our organizations, it's easy to just focus on their current capabilities and quote-unquote features and make assumptions about their actual value to people. And one piece of advice that I give when engaging with any company that's wanting to implement some new piece of technology or new toy or fad is to truly validate the human needs behind the technology, to make sure this innovation is not technology driven. And to talk not only to the experts, but people that are at a whole range of abilities and ages about the technology. And most of all is to avoid talking about brand, platform, or features. This just ends up being confusing to people and beyond the point. And I have a fantastic example that I can share with you of two companies who did just that. At the end of 2017, Google Play, which is a music arm of Google, and IDEO, the creative consultancy I mentioned earlier, teamed up and spoke to not only technology experts and developers, but also people ranging from elementary or primary school kids through to early adopters and even technophobes, people fearful of technology, to find out how normal people imagined emerging technologies like virtual reality, augmented reality, and digital assistants, and what it would be like to incorporate them into their lives. Now, when they met with people, they didn't focus on the features, the brand, the platform, the specific products that we all often get too swept up in, especially when we watch competitors around us bounding ahead with the latest app or digital tool. Now, this project was based on the premise, which I'm also a strong believer in, that when it comes to technology, if we hope to create something of lasting value, we need to start with what people want, not just with what is technically possible. So Google Play and IDEO, they ran people through a series of exercises designed to get people comfortable with imagining these technologies already existing and being a part of their lives. In this image, there was an exercise they ran with focus group participants where people were given random pictures of different scenes, like in this one is an underwater scene. And they were then given magic glasses, which they could draw on or sketch or create, design any augmented reality features that they liked. Remember, these people are not technology experts, so the world was their oyster. The results were really astounding, and some of the things that come out of the participants' mouths are completely unexpected, even for somebody like me that works in the technology industry. I really suggest you go and check out this YouTube clip. If you just Google IDEO emerging technologies for inspiration, or send me an email and I can send you the link. It's really an interesting approach to talking about the potential for technology. Number 3, the challenge of staying relevant as communities and customer behaviours change. With the changes to the National Disability Insurance Scheme at the end of 2017 in Australia, but also seeing similar shifts in the New Zealand market, focus is now subsequently shifted to the consumer having choice and control over which service provider they use. For the service providers, this places added importance on not only providing adequate levels of care, but also what suits the needs when considering your customer's whole of life at an individual level. This is a totally different value proposition. Now this, as well as other areas of the NFP sector, I believe could benefit, if not already, from integrating civic engagement as a core practice, but also utilizing a design thinking framework to explore, reframe, ideate, and prototype new products and services, not just for your constituents, but with your constituents, alongside as equals. Now, the example I mentioned earlier was with the Asylum Seekers Resource Centre. We were running a co-design workshop. They actually had a space which was basically a big lunchroom. You can see it in the background. Around about 200 of their 3,000 odd members visited the space each day for a free hot lunch. It also just happened to have a children's play area, a music area, a medical clinic, and administrative offices. Now, they had 2 problems, which they had when we came to them. Number 1, staff couldn't get members to stay long after lunch each day. They just came and they ate and they ran. And the different cultural groups never seemed to like mixing with one another, which kind of makes sense. We purposefully mixed up the tables in our 50-person workshop and had members of all ethnicities working alongside each other to create scaled prototypes of their dream ASRC space. What is it that would attract them and encourage them to dwell in this space? The results were incredible. I've got a couple of them here. Now, our participants didn't only come up with hundreds of ideas on how the space could be used, but they also developed a program of events that sat outside the physical space, which would ensure people would want to come back and connect and keep forming those relationships. It was a huge success. If you're based in Melbourne, I'd really encourage you to go and get along and see how the space and the program is doing. Number 4, the challenge of getting leaner, being more efficient. And many of the examples I've shared today, they're centered kind of around solving a project-based or an external challenge. But I can also see opportunities for design thinking to be used to explore opportunities to stretch every dollar further, so we say, by looking at your organization's existing processes and structures. Now, similar to the example I shared earlier about us bringing in the theatrical set designer to shake things up, you might also look for experts from other fields to engage on projects to drive greater efficiency in your operations day to day. Now, here's an example I came across the other day about reframing a problem with fantastic results. The food bank for New York City was looking for help and support, and instead of sending a check, Toyota decided that it would send its best engineers to try and improve the food bank's operational efficiencies. Now, at first, the team at the food bank were quite skeptical until they started seeing some of the results that came from fusing car manufacturing methods with food packaging and distribution for a social enterprise. The results were quite astounding. And again, there's a fantastic YouTube clip that tells the story and gives examples of how they address this challenge. Number 1, they managed to increase the number of boxes in one truck by 45%. That's 45% more packages or aid packages for families struggling in New York. They've reduced the packing time of one box from 3 minutes down to a ridiculously fast 11 seconds by simply implementing a production line model in their warehouse. And in one route, they now manage to feed 400 families in half of the time. It used to take them 3 hours, now it takes them about 1.4 hours. And some of these results would have only come, or did only come, when these two organizations were able to stretch their thinking and build off each other's ideas for incredible results. Number 5. This is going to seem quite odd, but I have saved what I think is the most inspiring news for last. Federal budget paper number 4. Now, don't log off straight away. This is going to be worth it. Trust me. Just stick with me. Now, even though we all regard government as slow-moving, relatively lacking in creativity and appetite for innovative, disruptive ideas, we all know that they're key as a partner to develop new policies that ensure the growth and prosperity of the NFP sector. So what does the future hold in terms of not-for-profits being able to continue collaborating with government? Now, before I read this quote, I'm also going to say that being a Kiwi, I'm also following the current government in New Zealand and our Prime Minister and some of the language and strategies that are being put into place around having a much more empathic view and deeper empathy for the people of New Zealand. So although this is the Australian budget, there's also a lot of momentum being built in New Zealand in a similar fashion. But for budget paper number 4, if you go and look on page number 12, you will see this. The government will trial new approaches to mobilising multi-skilled teams drawing on private sector and academia to work on whole of government challenges. This will include bringing the right experts together and the use of design thinking methodologies to help solve complex problems. It will also include incorporating citizen feedback, human-centered design, to help identify improvements to service delivery all the way through to implementation. Yes, that's right. Design thinking for complex problems in public sector organisations. Mind-blowing. And moreover, while the budget papers suggest a shift, that we could also easily surmise that many areas of government and actually some partner organisations I work with that consult in the government sector they're already using these methods every day to create and implement great policy and programs. I think this represents an opportunity for further developing your government relationships and partner projects by encouraging a design thinking approach. There, it's written in black and white. You can use this as a common language which we can leverage to truly innovate together. So, in closing, today I've shared with you the 5 things that I think all creative organizations do to drive innovation and how this is being codified or mapped to the approach of design thinking, which is a process for creative problem solving for positive social impact. And those 5 things were: organizations get inspired through empathy. They reframe problems and encourage divergence. They shelve constraints. They generate a lot of ideas. They prototype as early as possible, and they do it with a rough edge. And most importantly, they test in the real world. And if there's anything I'd like you to take from today, it's that it can be done on a budget with your own people and at speed. So before I sign off or we go into questions, I actually have an offer, something that I'd like to put to everyone who's tuned in today. If you are an organization that wants to kickstart a project using design thinking, its principles and its tools, many, many more tools than what I've just given you the whistle-stop tour of today. If you're stuck on a challenge or you have a challenge that you think needs a human-centered lens, or if you just benefit from a more hands-on introduction to design thinking for your team, we would like to offer 3 half-day introductory sessions on design thinking or a workshop for free to the 3 not-for-profits that would like to approach us first. And I understand that if you're based in Melbourne, this is ideal, but if you're in other states around Australia or in New Zealand, more than happy to talk about the best way we could make that happen. Perhaps we could do that over a video conference or use technology. There might be other ways to still facilitate the discussion. And of course, if you've got any other questions about the webinar, I'd like to chat. So I'm going to give you my email address, and I'd encourage you to get in touch, ask me as many things as you like. If you want to see more detail on those case studies, I'm happy to chat. So that's it. If there are any questions, I believe Tina has been logging them while I've been talking, so we can talk through some of those now. But first of all, I'd like to say a huge thank you again to everyone who's joined. I hope you found this useful, and also thank you again to Connecting Up and Tina and the team for this opportunity. My email is there. I believe we're going to be sharing the slide deck with everybody. Thank you very, very much. I've really appreciated it. And let's go to questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Dylan. We've had some people show some interest on your offer already. We've only got 1 question at the moment. So Joanna says, referring to your example of the racing pit crew coming in to help the emergency room work on how to be more responsive, is there a guide to help determine which disruptor consultant to bring in to help us look at solutions to our problems from a different perspective?
Good question. I think the short answer is there's no tool that allows you to sort of find the best alignment. My recommendation would be to list out the criteria, like with the insurance company that I mentioned, where they wanted to create a solution that was really flexible, really modular, really cost-effective, but also inspiring. If you take out those key criteria and you think this is how we want to measure the success of our solution, list them down, remove the context of the insurance company, and then brainstorm other sectors and go as broad as you can where those criteria are also measures for success. And that's why when you look at the emergency, the crash team in the ED department, they came up with the idea of engaging a Formula One pit crew because the outcomes that the pit crews seek were the same in that project. Okay, so that safety is a huge priority, and speed and efficiency, which means to do all of these things, their communication has to be incredibly efficient and fast, and they codify their language to be able to get messages across to people sooner, and even how they organize the pit lane to save even fractions of a second. It's an extreme circumstance, even extreme by emergency department standards, but it really challenged them, and it gave those two groups a common set of criteria to all brainstorm around. I mean, you could do it hypothetically by thinking, what are all the things that pit crews do to achieve efficiency? That hospital team just happened to go one step further, and don't know how, managed to get in touch with an actual pit crew. But if you can do that, I'd really encourage it. I had another quick example here where I was working on a design brief for a co-working space, and they were really interested in service design and experience design. The best partner we brought in was actually the team that created the service design model for the Qantas first class business lounges in Australia. And their level of attention to detail and quality and human experience was just something that the architects on the project had never seen before. And it really raised some really interesting ideas and questions. So I hope that helps.
Thanks, Dylan. That's all for questions. So is there anything else that you wanted to add before I conclude?
No, well, only to say thank you again, and I hope this has been worth everybody's lunch breaks if you are watching this live. And if my email's still up there on the screen, you'll get the slide deck in a few days, I believe Tina mentioned at the start. So don't be shy coming forward with those questions and crazy ideas. I think what's most challenging for organizations is trying to figure out how you can just pick one activity, just pick one thing that you can test in a weekly team meeting, in your next project kickoff workshop. It might be just a 10 or a 15-minute activity that you can do just to try some of this stuff and see what kinds of ideas, what kinds of appetite you can build. It's not you don't need to go into your organization and start with the CEO and try and change the whole strategic plan. Although if people listening to this call are CEOs, absolutely go and do that. But if you're someone that's just working in a project team, you can just pick one thing and experiment, as we say. So thanks. That's what I would say in closing.
Thanks, Dylan. And those of you who are interested in the offer, please send an email through to dylan@wire8.com.au to let him know that you're interested in taking that up. So thank you very much, Dylan, for presenting today, and thank you everyone for joining us. I hope that you have learned a lot from this presentation and that all your questions have been answered. If you have any questions that do come to mind later or any feedback about this webinar, please send that through to events@connectingup.org and we'll answer those questions offline. You can also contact Dylan directly via the information on your screen and in your webinar control panel. Don't forget that the recording will be available within the next week and a link will be emailed through to you, so keep an eye out on your inbox. Again, thank you for being with us and enjoy the rest of your day. We look forward to seeing you all next time. See ya.